Hi everyone, my name is Massimo and I am the creator of MADPIXELSORT. If you want to skip directly to the walkthrough, timestamps will be down in the description. I want to start off by thanking you all for being here with me. This project started earlier this year and has since become the biggest software project that I've ever worked on so far. This started with MADPIXELSORT Legacy, which was originally based off of Kim Asendorf's script, which was basically his script with user interface attached to make it a little bit easier for people to use. And shout out to Kim Asendorf for coming up with pixel sorting, by the way. I mean, I kind of really like it, considering I've made a whole app around it. Anyways, I was very happy to see a lot of people using the original open source app. And I really wanted angled sorting, and plus a lot of other features. I know that the original MADPIXELSORT Legacy was very limited in what it can do. Now, because I wanted really wanted angled sorting, I started a new app from scratch, and since that app has turned into a software suite that can not only do angled sorting but path sorting, so like curves, waves, and zigzags and stuff like that, with tons of different sorting modes, tons of different targeting modes, tons of extra little effects and features and stuff like that. And it can do photos, animations based off of a single image, and video. Now, I constantly tinkered to create new features. So like whenever I was creating a piece of art, I'd be like, oh, what if I use this for that or that for this? And that's how I came up with new features. Now, I'm only a single brain, right? I only have a single brain. So with that being said, new feature ideas are welcomed and encouraged. So make sure you join the official MADPIXELSORT Discord server down below. You don't have to use MADPIXELSORT in order to join the server. If you're just a fan of pixel sorting or any kind of glitch art or digital art, please feel free to join. And that way you can actually submit feature requests and you can vote on other people's requests. So yeah. With all that being said, I want to thank you for supporting me and the MADPIXELSORT project, and I can't wait to see your creations. Thank you. All right, let's get started with the walkthrough. First thing I want you to know is that you can come up here, click it, and then you can find all of the documentation. Release notes will open up in the website. Same thing with licenses, attributions, and the customer portal if you wanted to change your subscription. With that being said, let's open up an image. All right, so first thing to start off, click the sort button to start. All of your settings are on the left side over here. We're going to start off with an angle. Angle's pretty straightforward. We're currently at an angle of 0 degrees, and if we wanted to increase it, we can add 15. And as you can see, the angle changes. Now what we can do is if you want to click the little arrow button here, you'll see an arrow field essentially showing you exactly what direction you're going to be going. And click it again to hide it. And we'll bring that back to 0. Quantity reduces the amount of intervals sorted. So if I were to sort here, you can see there are a bunch of intervals. Essentially each sorted line that you see. If you remove the quantity, a random amount of them, so let's say it would only sort 50% of the intervals. As you can see, there are gaps in between them, and this is random. So if I do it again, and I go between the two, you can see that there's a difference between them. If you bring it all the way to 0, it won't do anything. Now, loops essentially loops the sorting algorithm and essentially sorts the image multiple times. Now, this is only evident in a few modes. I'm going to switch our interval to random for now. And if we do just once, you can see that the effect is pretty substantial. But if I were to loop it 5 times, it'll sort the image 5 times in a row. It'll take longer, and you can see that it essentially amplifies the effect. Now, if I were to do it on a threshold mode, it doesn't really do anything, especially when it's your angle set to 0 or 90 or 180, and so on. You can see a slight difference whenever the angle is set to something else. So if I were to do it again, you can see here that because of the essential inaccuracies when it's rotating it, it'll make slight differences. It'll essentially is just smoothing out the intervals, basically. Preserve settings when enabled essentially just modifies your settings based on whatever image is selected. So essentially, if I sorted this image with these settings, it'll show up every single time I click undo or redo. If I undo it, it'll just keep whatever settings I had it set to before. Now, for sorting modes, we have 9 different sorting modes, and they're all pretty straightforward. The default is brightness. Now, essentially the way this works is that it calculates the brightness of each pixel and then essentially just sorts them based on that brightness, right? And that applies to every single one. So, for hue, it would be sorting by hue, saturation would be sorting by saturation, and so on. Now, these all produce very different effects. So if you were to sort by, I'm gonna change the target to all for now, just so you can see the pure effect. Basically, it's going to sort the entire image. It's not going to generate intervals based on these values. If you sort everything by brightness, it's fairly straightforward. How you can see, these pixels on this side of the image are darker than the pixels on this side of the image. Now, by hue, you're going to get a much more different effect. Essentially, if you're familiar with the hue color wheel, I'll show an image on screen. It'll sort it by whichever direction is in that color wheel. It'll sort it based on that color wheel. If we do saturation, kind of the same principle. More saturated pixels are on the right, and then less saturated pixels are on the left. If we do it by RGB value, we can sort it by the red values, the green values, and the blue values. Now in this image, it won't make that big of a difference, but if you have a lot of pure reds, pure greens, or pure blues, it'll make a much bigger difference. Now intensity, essentially what this does is that it sums up all the RGB values together, and then it sorts it by that number. So it's somewhat similar to brightness, but again, the effect is a little bit blockier. The effect is a little bit grainier, almost like the hue one. The minimum sorting mode sorts intervals by the lowest number in the RGB value. So it behaves similar to brightness. That's minimum. I'll show you brightness again, and then we'll toggle between the two images. It's very similar, especially with the darker portions of the image. Not so much for the lighter ones. And random. So essentially for each interval, it'll choose a random sorting mode. And it can get pretty crazy. Alright, so inverse, essentially what it does is that inverses the sorting order. So usually, by default, it's sorted in ascending order. So in this case, since the arrow is going left to right, we're sorting from lowest to highest, left to right. If we inverse it, it does it the opposite. It sorts it from highest to lowest, from left to right. All right, next up are targets and intervals. So these two work together. And as I showed you earlier, if you select all for both of them, it essentially just sorts the entire image without any intervals. Now, I'm going to bring it back to its default, which is an inclusive threshold. So essentially what these numbers mean is, let's say we have the brightness value, right? And the brightness value ranges from 0 to 255. It's going to start the interval with pixels within this range. So anything higher than 20% times 255, which is 51. And then anything below 80% of 255, which is 204. And to see a visual clarification, so this is essentially what we did before. If we wanted to include this darker part of the image, we would reduce our lower threshold. And then, as you can see, all of this is the same except for the darker parts of the image. If we wanted to only affect the darker parts, we would bring the upper threshold down. And now you can see only this bottom part is affected. and the top isn't. If we only wanted to affect the brightest parts of the image, we'd bring upper threshold up and lower threshold up. And as you can see, the top part, which is the brightest, is affected. Now, I will put in some sort of visual indicator as to what these numbers mean at some point, but that's something for the future. Exclusive works the same way, except it's on the outside of these percentages. So it'll start the interval with anything lower than, in this case, 17% at 255, and anything higher of 79% at 255. So in this case, we affected the the darkest parts of the image and the brightest parts. Now for trigger. So what we can do is we can, whenever you're using a threshold mode, you can change what value is actually starting the interval. So what you can do is you can essentially start the interval by a hue threshold and then sort that interval by brightness, for example. You can come up with some really funky combinations here. Looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with. And match sort mode, essentially what that does is when it's selected or when it's enabled by default. Whenever you change your sorting mode, it'll automatically change the trigger mode. If you want that to not happen, then you just click that and it won't change anymore. We'll put that back on for now. All right, now on to intervals. So as we talked about the threshold modes, we also have random, which I showed you before. Now in this case, same thing applies here. When we choose threshold here, it'll only start intervals based in this area, but the intervals are the lengths of the intervals are randomly defined. So if you wanted to affect the entire image and just essentially do a random sort everywhere, you can see it has a very unique effect. And you can change how long that is with the scale slider here. As you can see, this is much shorter than before. If you were to go longer, it's much longer. Now, interval shift really only applies, it works on everything. It's just, it's not super visible with the random interval mode. And essentially what it does is, so like, let's say we have our inclusive threshold mode and everything here is sorted. If I were to increase the shift, it'll essentially move the interval over by a bit, and it kind of loops around. So if I were to increase it a little bit more, and a little bit more, you can see how the interval is just like slowly moving over. This is very useful in animations, and we're going to touch upon that a little bit later. But if you click redo and undo, you can see how it's increasing. And then essentially like loops through the interval. So max length essentially dictates the max length of any interval. Right now it's set to 100% of the image. So this is essentially a percentage of the image's width. If we were to set it to 50, you can see how the interval is essentially hard stopped here, and then it starts sorting again. And if we go even lower, you can see it repeats itself, basically. Minimum length is essentially the opposite. Now, let's say we're in inclusive sorting mode and we're only targeting this area. If we set the minimum length to a certain amount, to any amount other than 0, it'll sort everything by a minimum amount, at least. As you can see, it even sorted the darker parts of the image, even though it's not within the threshold, because that is the minimum amount that every interval is going to be sorted. Now, in order to avoid this effect, you can see this like blocky effect whenever you're using max length, there's random offset. So essentially what this does is that it randomly changes the length of an interval just a bit by its end. So if I were to increase it just a little bit so you can see, so instead of those straight lines that we had, you can see it's a little bit more blended somewhat. If we increase it more, you can still see the lines, but they're not as pronounced. So if I were to bring it back down to 0, just to show you the difference again, here. So we have our straight lines, and here we have our blended lines with the random offset. All right, now on to effects. So the gradient mode essentially replaces each interval with a gradient that is defined by its first and last pixels. So we're going to sort another inclusive threshold here. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn on gradient mode, and we're going to see a difference. As you can see, it essentially takes the first pixel and the last pixel and then creates a gradient between the two. Alright, so what you can do now that gradient mode is enabled, you can manually define starting and ending colors. Like, let's say I want to start every single interval off with pink, and then we're still going to use the last color. It's going to create a gradient between them. We can do the same thing for the end. Say if I want the end in blue, it'll do that. And if we wanted to do both the start and end, it'll look like that. If we did, let's say, random intervals targeting the entire image, this is what it would look like. This is useful for creating textures. And you can select the color by clicking here, and then you can drag it around. If you want to put in your own RGB, HSL, or hex values, you can do that. Or you can use a little dropping indicator. Now, feathering is pretty straightforward. It works the same way as in Photoshop. So let's go to all, so it's a little bit more visible. There we go. Feather is the start of any interval, so essentially blurs it out. As you can see, you can still see the original image here, just a little bit. But it only creates like a feather from the front to the middle. And feather end does the exact same thing, but from the end. So you can see here from the end, and it goes over here. If you have both at 100%, it's like the interval will fade in and fade out, basically. Smoothing blurs the image before it sorts it. Now, this can lead to a smoother effect. Let's say if we were sorted by hue, like we did here, and then we smoothed it out a little bit. As you can see, the little difference is that you don't have as much grain as you had before. If you were to increase the smoothing a little bit, or even more, you can see how some portions of the image are still a little bit blurred. Interval blur essentially blurs each interval by itself. So if we did this, and then we blurred it out just a little bit, as you can see, each line is being blurred out. And you can use just a little trace, little amounts to essentially remove any grain. All right, now on to pathing modes. So linear, pretty straightforward, straight line. Linear spiral creates a spiral effect. Essentially, it sorts it along one line, then it goes down, and it goes to the left, again back up in a spiral shape. Now, curve. Any of these, so curve, wave, and zigzag all have their little curve editor here. The scale goes up and down. So if I wanted to go below like this, I would go like this. And then it would sort in that shape, basically. Now, if we were to go back to our inclusive threshold before, it only affects this part of the image, and as you can see, it follows along that shape. So we can scale the semicircle up to the other side, and as you can see, it does the same thing. Wave is essentially a wave, and you can change its length like this. You can change its height. You can change the origin. If you sort it, as you can see, it goes up and down. Now, zigzag is exactly like the wave, but instead of round angles, it has sharp angles. And you can modify it the same way. Now, path size essentially increases the width of the interval. So as we did this before, as you can see, these intervals are 1 pixel wide. We can increase that to produce a blockier effect. So it changes to 10. As you can see, the intervals are wider now. If you look before and after here. All right, so now for masking. you can load a mask. Essentially what you need to do in order to create a mask, you would have to use something like Photoshop or any kind of, or Paint or any kind of photo editor. So what you would have to do is draw black, so pure black, and RGB would be 000 wherever you want to mask out, and then draw white, which is 255, 255, 255 everywhere else. Now, you can always invert this once you actually load it. And one important thing to know is that the mask has to be the exact same dimensions as the image. So this image here is 1920 by 1235 pixels. The mask has to be that exact same size. So we're going to open it. We're going to enable the mask, and then we can adjust the opacity to essentially see what it's going to be affecting here. Now, if we leave the opacity up a bit and I sort it, as you can see, it only sorted within the mask. Now I know that's a little bit hard to see, so let's change that. There we go. As you can see, it only sorted within our masked off portion, and if we wanted to invert it, we just click invert. As you can see, whenever you click invert, it'll just invert your mask, and then it sorts everywhere your mask isn't, basically. Now, base layer. What essentially this allows you to do is you can open up another image and then generate intervals based on the other image. So let me show you what that looks like. You have to open up a picture of the same size again. We're going to open that up as a mask. So we can, sorry, not as a mask, as a base layer. So we can increase the opacity to see the image. And what we're going to do, we're going to do another inclusive threshold sort. Oh, accidentally left it on. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but if we put our gradient up, as you can see where the intervals are being defined in the other image. And then you can invert that by going exclusive. And it's only sorting in where the darker parts of the base layer is. Let's disable it. I'm going to undo that. All right, now in terms of outputs, what you can do is you can output only the effective portions of the image. So if you sort it, it'll only output wherever it's sorted, basically. If you save it as a PNG after doing this, everywhere else is going to be transparent. And you can save it as either a JPEG or a PNG right now. Now, in order to save it, let's sort it, save it. You can change the name over here. Click Save. And if we open up our File Explorer, we'll see it here. And as you can see, the black portions of the image in the editor are completely transparent. All right, let's get started with animations. So what you do is you click New, Animation, and I'm going to use a small image, a very small image, just so it's much faster, so you can see the effects more real time. It's the same image, just much smaller. Now, as you can see, the keyframes window has opened up, and this is essentially how you create an animation. So, as you can see here, there's the frames input, there's the frames per second input, and then there's additive animation that got added to our little menu here. Now, frames will dictate how long our animation is. So let's say we create a 30 FPS animation and we want it to be 2 seconds long, we'll put in 60. If we want it to be 3 seconds long, we'll put in 90. And that's basically it. If you want to do 60 frames per second, and then just multiply this number by the amount of seconds you want, and that's basically it. But we're going to do 30. We're going to do 30 FPS animation. We're going to make it last 2 seconds. So additive animation, essentially what this does is that it just keeps on sorting the same frame every time. This works really well when you're doing random. So if we go here, let's preview it. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to select additive animation. And we're going to do, put the scale a little bit smaller, just so you can see. It's as if like, there you go. It's just sorting the last frame, basically, in a loop. And we're just going to let that continue until it's done. Now, if you want to, as you can see, you could probably tell that it looks very similar. It's starting to look very similar to if we just did this here. And over time, it would start looking like that. But if you wanted that kind of effect, you can do that. But we're going to remove additive animation, and we are going to bring our target back to threshold mode. You can animate any of these sliders where there's the little keyframe button here. So essentially what you're able to do is, let's say I want my shift, which is currently at 0, to go all the way to 100. Now if I do 100, it's just going to be the same thing. But as I showed you before, this essentially just moves the interval. So if I want to animate this over the course of the 60 seconds, I would click this button, and then that will take the starting value, I modify it to its ending value, and then I click the button again. And as you can see here, this little interval shift keyframe popped up. And this is the first number. This is the number that was put in when I first clicked the button. This is the second number that I modified it to when I second clicked the button. So we'll do it again. Let's do it. Let's do it with angle. So I click angle. It's going to take 0. That's a starting point. Then I modify it. Let's do 360. I click the keyframe button again, and then it's going to do 360. Now we're just going to delete this, and it's going to animate this from 0 to 100, but we need to tell it how many frames to animate it over. So in this case, we're going to do the entire animation. So we're going to start from frame 1. I'm going to end on frame 60. And let's see what that does. As you can see, it's slowly moving over the interval. Obviously, this is not real-time speed. I'll show you it later when I actually save it as a video. Now we can undo that. And here we have, we can change the speed of the animation basically. So if you're familiar with CSS, these will look pretty familiar. So we do ease in, we do sort. You can see it's slower at the beginning, and then it accelerates and goes faster once it goes over to the side there. And this is essentially dictated by and this speed is essentially dictated by something called a Bezier curve, and you can put in your own numbers here. So I'll put in a picture of a Bezier curve here, and P1 you can essentially manually change it. So right now it's default to just a straight line. It's the same thing as linear. Actually, whoops. But you can put in your own numbers here. At some point, I'll put in a little Bezier curve editor, and that's pretty much it for keyframing. You can do multiple of the same ones. So like, let's say I want to animate shift again. Problem is, if I were to have overlapping frames, it's going to take whichever one is the latest. So like, let's say I want 0 to 100 from the first frame to halfway. I'll do 1 to 30. And then I want this one to do the second half. We'll do 31 to 60. But this time we're going to change the direction. We're going to go from 100 to 0. Let's do ease in out for both and see what that looks like. So it goes all the way up. It goes all the way to the right. And then it'll go all the way back to the left. And you can see the current progress down here. That'll tell you how many frames is completed, the estimated time remaining, and how long each frame is taking. Now, currently, I only have open H.264 encoding in MP4 file format for now. I will add more in the future. And if you wanted to change this, you can essentially just save it as frames and then open up in Premiere or QuickTime and then do it yourself. But for the time being, if you want to just save it quickly as an MP4, you have MP4 selected by default. Click Save here. And then if we open up our File Explorer, we can see our animation here. If we play it again, and there we go. That's a saved MP4. If we wanted to save the frames, click Save again. We'll do the same thing. And then essentially I'll save it into a folder. And as you can see here, if we go through the frames, you have all the individual pictures here, basically. All right, now for video. Let's open up a video. I'm going to open up this one for now. I'm going to speed up this loading process. Give me a second. All right, so here's every single frame of the video. You can click it and you can see how it changes between each one. You can see here you'll have a little indicator telling you which frame it is and how, out of how many. And what you can do is you can essentially scroll through the video and then you can preview what it would look like on that selected frame. So right now I'm on frame 29. If I wanted to look what it looks like on frame 30, I'll click frame 30 and I'll click preview. The keyframing system works exactly as in the animation. And if I wanted to sort this video, basically like so, I'll just click sort. Now this is going to take a little bit longer because the resolution of the video is bigger. But this will take around, it'll take just under 5 minutes. So I'll speed this up. So again, I saved it as an MP4 just like before. And here's our end result. Looks pretty cool if you ask me. Now as you can see, now you click the frames, you can see the sorted result. If you wanted to reset that and start again, just click reset, reset image in memory, and it's going to reload the frames of the original video. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for using MADPIXELSORT, and thank you for being with me along this journey. If you're a fan of pixel sorting, digital art, or any kind of glitch art, please feel free to join the MADPIXELSORT Discord server. The link will be down in the description. And if you need any help, feel free to ask me questions in the Discord server as well. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I cannot wait to see what you guys come up with. Have a great one.